Just turn that hip, push my hips through and tuck them under a little bit more forward. And that was a really solid contact. Hi everyone, and welcome back to my channel. In today's video, I'm going to show you one of my favorite drills for keeping your weight more forward for the duration of the swing to help you make more solid contacts. One of the things we see often in golf swings is players moving their weight to the right for far too long and struggling to recover, really causing some low point issues where they're going to hit the ground before the ball, or lots of thin shots or bad contacts across the face. So let's get into it. So here on the iPad, you'll see that I have a student of mine, Pietro, and some of the things Pietro was doing in his swing is moving his mass excessively off center, and that caused some other things in his swing. That caused his arm to creep quite high, that caused him to stop turning, and we see all of his pressure move over to his right foot. So just to demonstrate that again here, if I just start to draw a line down the side of his legs here, okay, and then I box in his head, and I do exactly the same for Grant Waite, who's the model that I'm going to use here. So if I put a line down his legs and a box around the head, we're going to start to see some differences in how they move. Now, there are some setup differences, which I spoke about with Pietro, but for the purpose of this video, we're going to look at the bigger moving pieces. Okay, so into his backswing, you'll really see how early into the swing, the shoulders begin to move off center, the pelvis really starts to move off, and that's him loading into his right side, as that's what he thought he had to do to make a full swing. And we showed him that actually to make a fuller turn and work into your right hip joint, actually turning over your left hip might be a better option. So bear with me, I'll talk about that shortly. So here is Grant Waite here on the right, and we're going to see that as he starts to work to top his swing, he stays lovely and central. He does have a little bit of shift off to the right, please note that, but as he starts to work to top, he turns his shoulders, he extends his spine where it gets a little longer, and that's the things that keep him into the middle. But the noticeable here would be the lower half, would be the pelvis and how that has started to move. So I'm going to show you one of my favorite drills called the wrench drill, which I learned from Andy Plummer, who is the founder of Stack and Tilt, which I think is actually a really good idea, a model for this type of golf swing. So what I'm going to show you in this video is that wrench drill and how he starts to pivot around his lead hip. So again, just drawing a circle here on his hip, we'll notice that he is rotating around that joint, that front joint, and that allows him to work his hips much greater. He's actually able to rotate them a lot more and keep his weight a lot more central. So very simply, the wrench, okay, so imagine we have a socket and this is a wrench, okay, and the wrench would go onto a fixed point, and we would be able to then move or tighten or untighten something by moving the handle, okay? But this is a fixed point and we are rotating around that fixed point. And that's a really nice thing for many of us to think about, certainly guys that struggle getting their weight too far to the right or pivoting around this back leg. Effectively, we have a left hip and a right hip, and we can pivot through the center, or we can pivot around the right hip, or more around the left hip. And I believe for guys that sway off, pivoting more around the left hip might be some of the most useful pieces for you. So going into that, I want you to think about your left hip being the socket and the golf club being the wrench. And if I just pop the wrench onto my left socket, I want us to practice holding on to this left hip here, keeping this still, okay, and then turning or using the handle to then pull my right hip around, okay? Now, by keeping my weight over this knee and turning from here, I'm actually able to have a lot more range of motion into that right hip, because think about it this way. If I hold this here, I've got quite a big lever arm ready to move, okay? Whereas if I was to pivot around the center, I don't actually have as big a lever arm to move in the backswing, so actually we're quite limited. So from here, if I keep my weight forward, and I start with my weight a little bit forward, keep my weight into that left hip, and as I keep my weight forward, turn that right hip behind me, I can see that my hips are turning nicely in a circle, okay? And that's a really nice sensation for me. So certainly into the backswing, keeping my knee a little bit more over my left foot. It is allowed to move inwards a little bit, but it's allowed to twist inwards. And how I would set this up is I would actually allow my hips, knees, ankles all to turn outwards by about, let's say, 30 degrees apiece, okay? So now that's opened up the groin, opened up the knees, opened up the ankles, ready for me to move. As my feet are too much like this, the rotation side is very difficult and I can start to wobble side to side. So this actually, one, hurts my knee when I turn like this. So having them a little bit more open is helpful. And then another way to check if I've done this right and not just moved my ankles and I've actually moved the whole leg is if I start to flex my knees, I can see my knees are going more outwards over my toe line, which is a good thing. So that when I set myself up, I can then put a little bit of pressure just into this left knee. Keep that pressure there as I start to turn that right hip behind me. And I feel like my weight is quite a long way left. But as you can see there, it's not as bad as what it looks like. So as I start to turn to the top, I'm more in the center. Now, this is extremely helpful for hitting ball then turf, because if we understand where the pelvis needs to be at impact, I think it would make a little bit more sense. At impact, our hips will roughly be about 4 to 7 inches further forward than they've started. And with an iron, our chest will be anywhere between sort of 1 to 3 inches further forward than it started. Okay, but certainly from a pelvis point of view, it is 4 to 7 inches further forward than it started and about 20 to 30 degrees of rotation. So not as much as people think as well. Now, if we know that we want to be 4 to 7 inches further forward, because that gives me a good opportunity to strike ball then ground, swaying off the ball 4 inches by the time I get to the top leaves me anywhere between 8 to 10 inches to get back again, and that's just too much to do in a split second in the downswing. So for me, it makes more sense to stay relatively centered. Let's just say 0 degrees or inches of movement off center, and then I've only got to move forward the 4 to 7, right? And that's how I would see this going. So as I start to set myself up, keeping my weight forward in the socket, turning the wrench, so keeping this fixed, turning my right hip behind me, I think it would be relatively easy to make that ball first contact because I'm already ahead of the ball effectively. So then all I have to do is turn that hip, push my hips through and tuck them under a little bit more forward. And that was a really solid contact. I really felt that I had quite a lot of shaft lean. And that's another thing to think about, the shaft lean element. I think a lot of people assume that we get shaft lean from driving our hands forward. Actually, from setup to impact, we move everything a little bit forward. And if I leave the club head there and I start moving myself forward and my arms come with me, of course I'm going to see this lovely impact position. And that's really what I felt there for that shot. So let's try that again. I'm going to flare the feet, put a little bit of weight into my left hip. So we're looking at about 55–60% of our weight forward. Then again, just to remind myself, I'm going to put that in my left hip and I'm just going to turn that a few times, okay? And then from here, handle I'd put forward a little bit as well. So that's pointing at my left groin. Then from here, keeping everything there, turning that right hip behind me. I'm going to try and stay relatively centered, right hip behind, weight over the left foot, and then pushing forward. And again, another solid contact. And I think that's a really easy way to make contact. Another way I like to explain this to my students is, I'm not sure if any of you have ever seen before how they test golf clubs, but they have that single robot arm on a fixed point, and they put the golf club in the robot's hands or in the robot's arm. And that robot, from its fixed point, will make a swing, hit the ball, and they measure it. And then all they've got to do, because it's on a fixed point, is put the next golf club in, and then it would do that again. Now, his striking, or the robot striking, is so consistent because there's not too many moving parts. Whereas imagine that robot arm on that fixed point was on wheels and I come up behind it and I started moving him side to side in an effort to get some more speed. How consistent do we think that robot's arm would be at striking the golf ball? I think he'd certainly hit some, but there would be some other strikes in there as well, I'm sure you'd agree. So I like to think about that when I'm hitting balls as well. If my left arm is that fixed point around this left hip, I can still turn around this left hip, still generating quite a lot of power because I've got a big coil. And then I'm staying relatively centered, then pushing forward, tucking my hips and allowing my arms to go through. So one more time, I'd be here, handle forward, weight forward, turning that right hip more behind and swinging through. Now, that actually wasn't my best strike, but because my weight was enough forward, I was able to still catch ball and not ground. So come out a little bit bottom groovy, but I know that shot would have been absolutely fine. So I hope that video makes some sense into the changes I would have made with that student, how we can actually keep our pelvis more forward by understanding that it's okay to turn around the left hip. That gives the right hip quite a lot of mobility, believe it or not. Something I also didn't mention is able to turn the club a little bit more around in a circle, which I think is super helpful too. So I hope the video made some sense. And if you like the video, please give it a thumbs up. And if you could subscribe, it would really mean a lot. Thanks, and I'll see you all soon.